Welcome to Risky Business. In the early 90s, arcade fighting games were all the rage. Street Fighter II was a massive success, and just about every coin-op developer in the world was trying to cash in on the fighting game craze. The results were mixed, and for every great innovation like Fatal Fury or Mortal Kombat, there were a dozen or so cheap imitations. For this video, I would like to take a look at a series that kind of slipped under the radar, at least here in the West. Power Instinct. Known in Japan as Goketsuji Ichizoku or the Goketsuji family, Power Instinct was Atlus's attempt to throw their hat in the ring and was released into arcades in November of 1993, just 2 months after Super Street Fighter II. It wouldn't hit the Western market until a few months later, by which time Mortal Kombat 2 had already been released. This game would have been sharing arcades with the likes of World Heroes 2, Art of Fighting 2, and Samurai Showdown 2, just to name a few. This may be why many gamers overlooked Power Instinct. Atlus isn't exactly known for fighting games, or arcade games for that matter. This Japanese developer's most successful games were mostly role-playing and strategy games, like Shin Megami Tensei, their most noteworthy title. Although they did release some moderately successful action games for the home console market, including Friday the 13th and The Karate Kid for the NES, both of which were published by LJN. While on its surface Power Instinct looks like just another Street Fighter knockoff, it was made to be a parody of fighting game tropes and relied heavily on absurd humor, much of which was either lost in translation or flew over the heads of the Western audience. For example, the final boss is an old woman and one of the characters is a muscular strong woman because muscular woman equals comedy, I guess? The story of Power Instinct is simple. Ome, the matriarch of the Goketsuji family, has declared that every 5 years a tournament will be held to decide who would be in charge of the wealthy and powerful family. A tournament to decide who's in charge of a family? What a silly idea that is. Silly idea. Anyway, anyone with blood ties to the family can enter, leading to a zany cast of characters. Well, they were probably intended to be zany anyway. Of course, there's Angela, the aforementioned strong woman from Italy who loves heavy metal. Annie, a spoiled rich girl. Keith, a Terry Bogard-like character, American Joe, who is in love with Annie, to whom I will remind you he is related by blood. Otane, younger sister of Ome, who, like her sister, can transform into a beautiful young woman but often chooses not to, and instead to throw her dentures at her opponents. Reiji, a parody of the traveling warrior archetype who works construction during the day. Saizo, a ninja who speaks a made-up language and spends his days performing in an animal costume. Fin Nen, a horny monk. And White Buffalo, a tongue-in-cheek spoof of the Native American stereotypes that have appeared in other fighting video games. The final boss, Ome, is not playable, but she's an exact copy of Otane, so it doesn't really matter. With only half as many playable characters as Super Street Fighter II, Power Instinct probably seems less exciting at first glance. However, it obtains a number of unique features that make it stand on its own. Characters can dash and also double jump. These two types of movement add an incredible amount of depth to the cross-up game and give players more tools to pressure opponents as well as escape from being pressured. There are also destructible objects on each stage which, after breaking, will allow the players to access a much larger playable area. 4-button controls are used here, which has always been my preference when it comes to fighting games, and while some characters have moves that will feel very familiar, a number of the inputs are confounding and some moves don't seem to fit into the character's moveset at all. For example, Keith's anti-air is a quarter circle from forward to down. And while 3 of his moves are circle moves, he has one charge move, which I kind of forget he even has while I'm playing, because there's really no reason to ever charge. There's also air throws, but I've never really been able to pull those off anyway, so I won't have one in the clip for you. Combos definitely feel similar to Street Fighter. There's no combo counter on the screen. I think combos were still pretty new to fighting games at the time. There are some rare moves that can juggle opponents, but it feels accidental and it's not consistent. That's probably why the characters seem to only partially fit some of the fighting game archetypes. It seems like they all have a little bit of a deviation kind of baked into their characters so they can move out of that box if they want to. The way this game is built is excellent though. It makes for a really fast and exciting gameplay. I do recommend playing this one with another player because the single player mode is one of the most frustrating I've ever experienced. It's not unusual for arcade fighting games to have broken AI, but the AI cheating in this game is just egregious, and it gets worse the farther you get into the game. By the time you face your penultimate opponent, they're doing extra damage, canceling startup and recovery frames and reading your inputs. It makes it impossible for you to do very much by way of offense, and they can counter and do combos that a human player could never do. Some of the comedic elements come out in the background, with the animated characters doing various shenanigans. There are these little guys called Kuro. They're little ninjas who imitate the fighters and cheer them on, and sort of do their own little shenanigans in the background as well. Power Instinct was ported to both the Mega Drive and the Super Famicom, but only the Super Famicom version was localized in the West. These ports contain a number of special modes, as you would expect from a console port, but the SNES version lacks the animation for the endings. They're both huge downgrades from the arcade. I mean, the graphics are terrible on both versions, and the SNES version is the worst of the two ports because there's so much animation missing, and that's really unusual. You know, a lot of times when you take a Super Nintendo game and a Genesis game and you put them side by side, most of the time it's the Genesis game that's going to have missing animation or missing graphics, but in this case it was the reverse, which is a little bit unusual, and a real shame because they're both pretty terrible ports. So the game was moderately successful in Japan, but the Western market didn't care for it. The reviews for both the arcade cabinets and the SNES version were much poorer than those of their Japanese counterparts. Remember, of course, that while these are not great ports by any stretch of the imagination, we didn't have the ability to play arcade games at home back in those days, so it was kind of the best thing you could get. If you haven't played Power Instinct yet, though, I definitely recommend you give it a shot. It's one of the best fighting games that I've played that wasn't a major mainstream success of a fighting game, and I think it's very slept on. Now, these humble beginnings would mount to much more than you might expect, with some of the games in the future of the franchise being really incredible. And we're going to cover each and every one of them. Next time I revisit this topic, I'm going to talk about Power Instinct 2. So make sure you subscribe and enable notifications so you don't miss that video, as well as the subsequent Power Instinct videos, and of course all the other content that I bring out as well. Power Instinct 2 is interesting because it adds a stress meter, so we have meter for the first time in a Power Instinct game, and it really begins to shape up kind of the future of the franchise. It expands the transforming characters that we have with Omi and Otane, makes that more of a staple of the game. It's gonna become a lot more interesting. Thanks for watching. Please leave a comment. Let me know you're out there. Like this video if you haven't done so already, and until next time, game over.